Right. So we'll get started here in about 30 seconds. Feel free to grab yourself something to drink, some water, caffeinated beverage, grab yourself a snack, sit back and relax. And we look forward to having a great conversation today with our panelists as well as with all of you. You'll notice that we have decided to do this webinar in more of a meeting format. So we are looking forward to including all of you in the conversation once we get started. Thank you all for being here. All right, it's 11:03. I know we have a packed conversation today for the next hour and a half, and let's just go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone who is able to join, and we know a few more will be rolling in as we go. Also want to say hello to those folks that are tuning in to this after the fact and watching the recording. For those of y'all who don't know me, my name is Kenneth Steele. I am the Healthy Communities Program Manager at Pinnacle Prevention. I'm joined by Leo Lopez on my team, who will be helping us with all things technology and logistics. So if at any point during the meeting you are experiencing any technology or logistical issues, please feel free to message Leo directly. So Leo, do you mind just waving, saying hi so everyone can see you? We also have a couple other team members here as well, Persephone, and then also our executive director, Adrian. So Parker's here. I might be missing someone, but just feel free to let myself or Leo, Adrian know if you're experiencing any issues or have any kind of technical questions. Before we officially get started, I want to ensure that participants are aware that this meeting does offer the option to have caption translation into multiple options. So in this slide that Ryan has pulled up, one of our panelists, you can see that if you go to your bottom toolbar, you'll see an option where it says CC or captions. You might need to go to the ... more button and click that. And then once you have that pulled up where it says captions, you'll be able to enable your translation so that is toggled to the right. And then you can choose your caption language. And then as folks are speaking throughout the course of this webinar, you'll get a simultaneous translation on the bottom of your screen from English to Spanish, for example, as shown here in this slide. I'm going to pause for a moment and let Leo kind of just translate what I just said into Spanish.
Buenos días para todos. Lo que Kenneth nos estaba contando es que antes de comenzar la reunión quería asegurarse que todos los participantes sepan que la reunión ofrece la opción de traducción de subtítulos a diferentes idiomas. En la imagen que están viendo en este momento pueden ver cómo activarla. En la barra de herramientas abajo va a aparecer un botón CC, o en algunos casos deben utilizar el botón que es more si está en inglés, o más si está en español. Y dentro de esas opciones pueden habilitar My Captions, y ahí seleccionan el idioma apropiado al que necesitan traducir el seminario, y una vez que los subtítulos estén habilitados van a ver el texto traducido en la parte inferior de la pantalla.
Thank you so much, Leo. All right. Also, we want to let folks know, as you noticed when you joined, that this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting this recording to our YouTube channel and also sending like an email back to all the folks that registered. In that email, you'll get access to the chat. We're hoping that a lot of resources will be shared, a lot of good conversation will happen there. On our YouTube channel, we won't be able to see the chat, but we will be able to see the visual and audio. In the future, we'll also include a recording of this webinar to our website as we build out the Smart Growth Arizona online toolkit, which is kind of a longer overarching project that this webinar is a part of. So let's go ahead and get started. I have been looking forward to this conversation for weeks now, and I'm really excited to hear from our incredible panelists. I want to remind folks that this is truly going to be a conversation. So we chose to have this kind of meeting format so that we can see your lovely faces, so we can hear your voices. So if you are in a place and do have the bandwidth to turn on your camera, we do appreciate that. We would love to see you, see your body language, see your smiling faces, see your frowns when we get to the parts that are kind of frustrating. And then also we hope to have a free flow discussion going on in the chat. We encourage attendees to drop links, resources, make comments in the chat. We'll also be pausing periodically to answer questions. If you do have a question, you would like to verbalize it, feel free to use the raise hand feature where you can raise the little hand icon in your box. And then also, if you aren't speaking, please remember to mute yourself so that we can hear our panelists clearly. As Ryan has put here on the screen, feel free to introduce yourself as well. Let's go ahead and share, your name, your organizational affiliation if you do have one, and then lastly but not least, can you share your favorite walking, bicycling, or public transit memory? So, is it walking the National Mall in Washington, D.C.? Is it a stroll through Central Park? Is it something here in Arizona? It doesn't matter if it's urban, if it's rural, if it's a hike, if it's a race, if it was in another country, if it was just in your own neighborhood walking your dog, whatever it is, share one top memory of you taking, one of these modes of transportation. I'm seeing some things coming in through the chat. This is lovely. Okay, wonderful. I can't wait to go and get caught up on some of those things. But for the sake of time, I'm going to continue on with the conversation and just introduce this topic of people first streets. You're here because you're interested in this topic for some reason. So y'all are my people. We have registrants from all over the state, maybe from a couple other states as well. I know one of our panelists is joining in from DC. We have panelists from the public health sector. We have folks from the community development, or registrants from the public health sector. We have folks here that are from the community development sector, those that are working directly, in transportation as planners or as engineers. We have those that are advocates and members of different coalitions and advocacy organizations. We have some that are still in school that are learning about urban design, and we also have folks here that are just interested residents as well. With that being said, we know the phrase people first streets might resonate to each one of you for different reasons. For us at Pinnacle Prevention, we are a nonprofit that is based in Chandler, Arizona, but we do serve Arizona statewide. And we work to cultivate a more just food system. And we also work to create more opportunities for joyful movement. And we know that in order for people to move with joy throughout their neighborhoods and throughout their communities, we need to have streets that are not centered on cars, but that are centered on people and the various ways in which people move, not only to be active and get their exercise, but also to get to their everyday destinations, whether it be school, whether it be work, whether it be to the grocery store, to the farmer's market, or just to go visit a neighbor or visit a friend. So that's why it matters to us at Pinnacle. But also, we know we have folks that are tuned in from public health or from the healthcare that know that, people first streets that make it easy, that make it comfortable, that make it safe for people to walk, bike, or roll. They're proven to help increase physical activity levels, and that physical activity helps us prevent, manage, heal, rehabilitate from various physical conditions, chronic diseases, and even impacts our mental and behavioral health as well. Not to mention, it helps people connect to one another. If you're familiar with Charles Montgomery and the Happy City, just those little interactions you have with people on the train, on the street, the little smile, the little head nod, those are beneficial to our social health as well. For other folks here, we know that streets that don't put cars first also encourage alternate, more environmentally friendly ways to get around, such as light rail, streetcar, micromobility. These more sustainable modes of transportation help create a healthier planet. It means less respiratory illness. It means less impacts from urban heat island effect. As we recover from the hottest summer on record in Maricopa County, we know how important this is. And we know that heat-related illness, heat-related death disproportionately impacts individuals living in lower income communities, our elders, and also our unhoused population. There's also the elephant in the room. In a lot of our communication promoting this webinar, we know that hundreds and hundreds of pedestrians and then dozens and dozens of bicyclists are dying on our streets each year in Arizona. And these figures, just like in the rest of the country, are increasing each year. Um, and this is despite well-intentioned efforts, all kinds of efforts, education, enforcement, um, technological advancements in motor vehicles, despite, folks trying to ride their bikes in groups. The groups are still getting hit. Um, and we know that even despite well-intentioned street design from the past, or well-intentioned street design from the present, that folks are still getting hit, and people are getting severely injured. People are dying, and disproportionately, these folks that are dying and being impacted are also low-income communities and communities of color. In Smart Growth America's Dangerous by Design annual report, um, Arizona is the 4th most dangerous place to be a pedestrian. In the Phoenix metro area, we're just outside of the top 20 and cities in the nation, and Tucson moved all the way from number 40 in 2020 to number 13 in 2022, despite a ton of great work to improve the safety of pedestrians and bicyclists by government officials working together with nonprofits in the community. This is a very complex issue, so we're going to talk about that today. So we're not going to just talk about safety. We're not just going to talk about health, but also we're having this conversation in the broader context of smart growth development. And we all know that Arizona is growing. We are a really fast-growing state. We are one of the fastest-growing states in the nation. The population increased by a whopping 12% between 2010 to 2020, and then in Maricopa County, more people moved to Maricopa County between 2020 and 2021 than any other county in the nation. But how are we growing? This growth is inevitable, but how are we growing? Are we growing in a smart way? Are we growing in an equitable way? And this is a concern for a lot of government officials, including our state health department. So the state health department has included a smart growth objective within its health equity priority in its state health improvement plan. And they are funding this Smart Growth Arizona webinar series. So shout out to them for making this a priority. And smart growth development may not be a term that everyone is familiar with, but it broadly refers to a mix of land uses, embracing compact design patterns, creating a range of housing options, a range of transportation options, walkable neighborhoods, developing communities with a strong sense of place. It means preservation of open space and farmland and critical environmental areas. It means making development decisions and growth more transparent, more fair, more engaging of the community, and stakeholder collaboration should be centered in all development decisions. So we can't wait to dive into this topic with our panelists. And we again appreciate all of you being here. We are going to take the next about hour 15 minutes to dive deeper into some conversation, to answer some questions that we've come up with, as well as some questions that you all submitted even as you registered for this webinar. And then we will take questions as we have time throughout the webinar, as well as we reserve time at the very end to have a dedicated Q&A section. So with that being said, thanks again to all of you for introducing yourselves in the chat, and for sharing your favorite walking, bicycling, or public transit memory. I'm going to now shift into our introduction of our panelists. You'll just hear my voice for just a couple more minutes, and then you're going to get to hear from other folks, which I'm sure you're looking forward to. So our first panelist is Ryan Wozniak. Ryan holds a master's in urban and environmental planning from Arizona State University, and he is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He has over a decade of experience, and he retains his passion for shaping urban systems, including land use, development, transportation policy, and urban design. His commitment to inclusive community engagement and best practices in urban planning is evident in his role as a senior transportation planner at TYLin International, as well as his active involvement in his local community and professional associations. I think there's too many to list right now. I think Ryan is involved in a lot of different organizations, good work outside of his day job. You may have heard his voice on podcasts like Main Street Mesa and also Talking Headways. Next, we have Edgardo Munoz. He is the visionary behind the OS3 movement, or Cero Ese Tres movement, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the promotion of cycling and outdoor activities in Santa Cruz County, Arizona. He's left an indelible mark through many of his transformative initiatives. In 2022, he formed he formed the first binational youth mountain biking team in the US, consisting of approximately 20 middle and high school students for both sides of the US-Mexico border. Furthermore, he is the driving force behind We Love Nogales, on the Santa Cruz County Public Media, which is a dynamic social media platform integral to a well-crafted and ongoing campaign aimed at raising the profile of Nogales and Santa Cruz County. This initiative showcases his commitment to promote the region and foster connectedness across borders. Lastly, our third panelist is Vanessa Cascio. She is the program and policy manager at Safe Routes Partnership, and she is responsible for supporting the program operations of the Safe Routes to Parks Activating Communities program at the local and national levels. In this role, she provides technical assistance and coaching, develops resources, builds relationships to support communities nationwide, and works to improve walking, biking, and rolling to parks and other essential destinations. In addition to being part of the team to help grow the emerging area of Safe Routes to Parks, Vanessa also supports the program and policy team on related areas of active transportation, safe routes to school, and advancing equity in policy and programs. She has a master's degree in public health from the University of Arizona. And she used to work at Living Streets Alliance in Tucson. So we miss her dearly in our state, but are thankful that we are still able to remain connected. All right, so we've introduced our panel. Thank you all for introducing yourselves again. My first question for the panel is directed to Edgardo. And I want to know how cycling, walking, and access to recreation opportunities has impacted your life specifically, as well as the lives of your neighbors and of your community.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Thank you, Pinnacle Prevention, for the invitation. And yes, how this has impacted my life, I will say is one of the most important things that have happened to me, after reconnecting with bicycle again after 30 years since I was a kid, I think it's one of the best things that have happened, because at that time I was suffering for some personal issues and had me in depression. So luckily, a friend, introduced me to cycling. So I never thought, all the benefits that I was going to receive just by cycling. But before I cycle, I was walking. And also another important thing that I need to mention, that I had to walk and cycle, is because first of all, a necessity of a way of transportation. I did at that time, my car broke, Like I mentioned, I was struggling a couple of personal issues, and I need a way to transportation. And in my community is considered a rural community, and we don't have a public transportation service. So I start walking. Then I saw the necessity that I need another type of transportation that gets me faster and easier way to go from point A to point B. So I'm glad that I find the bicycle, and you never know. No, now today I felt the necessity to share my experience with other people, and working very close with the education system in our community, with government, with other health organizations. Since I'm a graphic designer, I was seeing all these issues that was in my community, and a lot of that, was related to depression and things like that. So I saw the necessity that I have to share my story. So now, we have this beautiful organization that we are celebrating 10 years, of our 10th anniversary. We are around 50 active cyclists right now. We were a little bit more, but since the pandemic, the number dropped, but we're growing again. We have a very nice relationship with other organizations, government. We said the necessity to do a really nice connection with the government, build the first natural park dedicated to mountain bike and hiking in our community. A park that was built from scratch, but with these wonderful volunteers from our community. And you can notice that people, if you send a message to the community, the community will gather and will work together, and we have built lots of community rights in our community. Recently we brought the first marathon to our community that has been a huge success, with more than 600 participants this year, and we're looking forward next year to bring even more. So definitely the cycling and walking for me has done a lot of things, and it seems that our community is taking it pretty well, and also adopting cycling, and now we're in a stage that we are working even closer with our authorities to bring more infrastructure, because what I have learned in these past years, if we also have the right signage or culture, creating more culture to our community, definitely we will bring more cyclists to our community, and also pedestrians. So yes, the impact has been wonderful for me.
Thank you so much, Edgardo. Thanks for sharing some of your story, your personal story, as well as the story of your organization, the work y'all are doing in your community. So we know, the many benefits of walking, bicycling, of active transportation, whether it's on the street or off the street. And we know these benefits extend both from the personal level to the community level. But my next question is for Ryan. So how did we end up, though, with a predominantly car-centric infrastructure here in Arizona? What historical and current systems of decision-making led to this status quo of roadways that often feel hostile for those that choose to, or that are forced to, travel via more active, kind of human-centered modes?
Thanks for the questions, Kenneth, and thanks to Pinnacle Prevention for this. Happy to tackle this. And I know when we were talking about this topic, I kind of started with the how, and I wanted to back out into a little bit to the why, because we can get into the hows and the whats later, but it's really for best alignment purposes in terms of policies and what to be aware of. It's better to start with the why question of how we become car centric. And so kudos to Copenhagenize. This is an organization that comes out of Copenhagen that really helps promote our recenter our concepts around active transportation. And they put this really simple graphic together to help us understand history of traffic engineering as technology has evolved over time. And so going back to when communities had no choice but to be compact if they wanted to be connected and accessible to people on horse or foot. You're talking about something between 6 and 3 miles per hour. So you can't really have great access throughout a well spread out or much spread out community. And then comes, additional technologies that get us to 10, 12, 15 miles per hour. And those routes still stay pretty direct, so they're the ones that are prioritized. They're the ones that still rue the right of way, our streets. And then comes the advent of more technology, and the car starts introducing itself, but it's not reliable yet. And it's really only for a toy for the rich. And so our cities still stay pretty compact, but we see a lot of roadway deaths, and there's this huge backlash into how do we accommodate this technology into our streets. And death tolls were pretty substantial back then, so it was thought, or there was debate in this time as to what to do. Do we keep allowing this to go forward, or how do we best tackle this death in our streets? And so what ended up happening over the course of decades was that more and more of the right-of-way was dedicated to clearing out space for motorists to have this forgiveness of, you have a zone all to yourself, and we'll try to keep everybody else out of the way. And decades of policies that have promoted car dominance have now yielded, in the US context, the straightest paths or the most direct routes for cars, and sort of everybody else's paths have become chopped up or indirect. And so that has an effect in terms of our development patterns and how much we have to allocate space for parking and so forth and so on. And before you know it, you don't have very many crosswalks. You have these very circuitous routes. If you're a pedestrian or you're a cyclist, you're having a hard time finding the safe routes to make your path, to make your way. And so what we make easy is what's get chosen. And so while safety is not the high point of today's conversation, smart growth and car dependence does have safety consequences. As much as we've tried to clear the right of way and the streets for people to give that technology choice of the car that's its primary zone, we see that there's an inequitable impact on people that are on foot or on bike. And so Arizona does not rank very well, and trends are not going well for these vulnerable road users. And so there's become a cultural talking point as to, okay, what do we do? It's alarming. And there's debates about how much we're distracted or all that, but really I think the number one cause that the industry and advocates agree on is that speed is always a factor. And so the travel speeds and the rate of death increasing exponentially with every 10 miles per hour we drive faster, we have ourselves a conundrum. And with speed, also development pattern spreads out. So access via speeding motorists end up becoming, influential into how we develop. So we have to ask ourselves, if technology shapes our streets and shapes our development patterns, what does the future have for us? And so the advocates at Copenhagenize would say, what we've been able to do in Copenhagen and the Netherlands is promote cyclists and cycling and walking by making those the most direct paths and correcting for this technological error of yielding so much to the motorist. And so that's why we see folks in that part of the country or part of the world, really pushing themselves or seeing a greater mode shift towards those choices. And the choices of technology that are coming our way aren't coming to an end anytime soon. So we have to be wary in terms of these unintended consequences or impacts with future technologies as well, whether we're talking about manned drones or autonomous vehicles. And so the future, the outcomes are really what we have to keep in mind as to what we want, and then be wary of the unintended consequences of our policies. And I'll quickly touch on measure of success so that it helps us be outcome minded. If we measure only the vehicular capacity and mode to ensure that a number of people can get through the system via car, we're limited in our capacity. We mix in a little bit more frequent buses, we expand our capacity a little bit more. We introduce cyclists, a very human scaled form of transportation. We can even have more, make more use of people within that right of way, make more use of our capacity. And dedicated transit lanes, boom, we get more capacity grows yet still. And number of people you can fit on a sidewalk, again, capacity expands still. So we're seeing that, we have this efficiency effect, with these alternative forms of transportation outside of a car. So it's really a smarter use of every inch of our pavement, which then triggers that compact and smart growth mentality that we can get from leveraging this. But it comes with a level of investment that, we may not have. And if we limit ourselves through this vehicular level of service, then we're also potentially limiting the compact development that we can have. Because if we assume that everybody's going to get around by car, we have to spread people out further, because that capacity with our roadways gets eaten up faster. But with mode shifts and the proper design of our transportation system, we can make smarter, more efficient use of that right of way and have skinnier, more livable streets. And so, again, we have limited feet within our right of way, allocating so much space for the car and crowding out all other uses. One is hostile and not very comfortable for communities to live in. By limiting how much space within our roadways we allocate to cars, we get to something that supports more smart growth, more livable communities. One is very expensive and does not serve the households without a car, and one does, has more equitable service, supports more equitable outcomes. So with that, I'll kind of close there with that brief history as to why we're at where we're at.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for taking us kind of on a journey from way back in the past to even the present, and to the present and even to the future. I appreciate your thoughts on kind of why we're at where we're at, as well as what we need to be thinking about when it comes to technology, and also how are we measuring what success looks like. And let's before we move to this chat question, just want to acknowledge we had a couple comments in the chat. The Ryan Stevenson also mentioned, the growing size of vehicles playing a role in safety, and Liz also agreeing with Ryan and also talking about the growing size of service vehicles. I know service vehicles look a lot smaller in other countries. So yeah, there's some food for thought there. Now let's move on to our next chat question. We encourage all of you to participate and just place in the chat, what is the largest barrier to having people first streets in your community? So we'll take a moment here to gather some responses. All this is informing the work that we're doing together ongoing. So I think all of your feedback is really important for us to consider. How are we better meeting the needs of different communities throughout the state and the challenges that they're facing? So I see traffic engineer, status quo, regional transit authority, America's love affair with fire truck, different goals of community members for the same spaces. others, what are the biggest barriers? Is it a funding issue? Is it a political will issue? Is it a capacity of advocates issue? Is it an education issue? Is it the engineers? Is it the planners? Keep those thoughts coming in the chat. The ridiculous width of our street. Lack of infrastructure for safe pedestrian travel. People that don't have a vision of the quality of life benefits. Overcoming historical design. Light rail constructed so that sidewalks are constricted and favored for cars at the moment. Lack of political will, capacity to coordinate efforts around implementation. So these are all great responses. Thank you all for submitting those. We are sprawling. Great point, Sergio. Valuing cars over people, need to put in barriers that send cars to the body shop instead of bodies to the hospital. Yeah, more food for thought here. Let's move on to my next question here. So let's check in with Vanessa and see, issues with pedestrian safety, lack of infrastructure to support active modes like walking, like biking, like transit, of travel, and lack of walkable neighborhoods. These are not just Arizona issues. And where else are we seeing similar experiences? And what are folks, what are individuals doing? What are agencies doing about it? So yeah, I just want to hear from you and your perspective on this.
Thanks, Kenneth. Thanks, everyone. One thing I want to first start off with is I think it's really important, the title of this webinar is People First, right? And I think Kenneth and other panelists have already queued it up really well that this is a health crisis, right, on our roadways. And I realized today that we're actually on the heels of the World Day of Remembrance, which is a growing movement kind of honoring the fact that there's people that are dying on our roadways, pedestrians, bicyclists, but drivers too, because of the design of our streets. And while this seems really grim, I think one of the points I want to make sure to make is like, we actually have and know the tools that work to fix this, right? And we have evidence-based measures, countermeasures. We know like the tools in the toolbox, and like Ryan was alluding to some of that in the slides previous, but again, this is about people, right? And we have the power to choose to use those tools or not. And the reality is many people don't even know what those tools are, aren't aware of them, or may not know that things can be different. And this goes for like community folks as it does for folks who work within agencies too, who have been trained as engineers or planners and are trained to do it one way. And it's really hard to move the ship in a different direction, right? But it matters. It matters a lot. And I think, starting off with the fact that, we have inequities in the way our communities are built, and we see that in low-income communities, communities of color. If you're new to this space, one important resource that we have that I encourage you to check out, and I can send it to you, or Kenneth can send it to you after the webinar, or if you have it available, Kenneth, we have what we call our mobility justice resource, which is really meant to be a primer to start thinking about how did we get here, and what are some of the present day funding and policies and the decisions that got us here. And I think this is important because I don't want to pick on Arizona, but this is an issue across the country, right? And we see this in communities in every single, in all 50 states. But I think one of the things that we as an organization have done really well is like getting folks to think about, well, how do we start to shift these mindsets, right? How do we start to encourage folks to realize like we have the power to choose, we have choices and we have tools in this toolbox, and making the idea of walking, biking, and rolling really resonate with community members. And so that's why I want to introduce this concept of like finding the right frame or finding the right hook to make the conversation around active transportation more broadly accessible to community members. And really thinking about the question of what does my community care about, and how do I build off those community assets to start making this really pressing issue important for people, and really like bringing them along. And one really effective hook that we've seen work really well is Safe Routes to School programs. At one point, Safe Routes to School programs were in all 50 states. Because of previous transportation legislation, now, you know, they're not mandated anymore, but it's something that we know works well. We have the research and the evidence base to show that Safe Routes to School programs work. But also, on a personal level, I want to give a shout out to my colleagues in Tucson, Living Streets Alliance. We saw this program really help to bring in families, school district officials, leadership, and really start to elevate this issue in a way that hadn't been on their radar before. And I think that's really powerful. One of the communities that I worked in, you know, made it really clear that, you know, we don't have a lot. You know, we have deep poverty, we have economic development issues, but one thing that we really care about is our youth. Youth are our greatest assets. And so we found a way to build our program to make sure that youth are really at the center of building leadership skills, of civic engagement, and really making this about youth mobility, right? So I think Safe Routes to Schools can be a really powerful hook to like start to think about these things. Another sort of hook or framing that we've seen work really well in communities, and one that may resonate in Arizona in particular, is Safe Routes to Parks. So thinking about parks as another really essential community destination, parks, green spaces, outdoor spaces, making them accessible to people of all ages, and really working towards making sure people can get to them safely by biking, walking, and rolling. I was working in a community in rural central Pennsylvania this last year, and they had started an active transportation initiative, right? They had started to do work around trying to get improvements to their street. They had this really great like little main avenue with local shops and businesses. And when they started working with us and we started working on their Safe Routes to Parks plan, they saw this momentum being built around active transportation that they had never seen before. And they were shocked. They were like, you know, we've been talking about this for a year with our community members, but it wasn't until we really made the focus of this parks that people start to care. And what we realized is because people really care about our park space. We have world-class fishing and streams in our parks. We have these historical landmarkers. And when we started to think about who would care about having more access to these spaces, like we broadened the base, right? We broadened those group of stakeholders and made the conversation relevant for them too, and saw this movement. So I think that's like one important message to think about in the local, like what are people doing on the local level, but trying to find the messages that resonate, the programs that resonate with people to bring them in. At an agency level, as an organization, we publish what's called our state report cards. So every 2 years, we look at what states are doing across the country when it comes to active transportation. We look at how they're spending their funding and dollars to support their communities for biking, walking. We look at what kind of policies are they passing at the state level to support this, and what other supportive practices for safe routes to school might they be doing. And I introduce that because what we see is when we publish these reports, we're actually going to be launching our next iteration of them next year, is that this provides an opportunity, right, for advocates, but also agency folks of sort of evaluating like, oh, okay, like this is where we're at. What can we be doing better, right, to improve our areas in this our different policy areas, right? It can be used for public health practitioners. So a tool that worth sharing, but I just wanted to make sure that like to connect both what happens on the local level, but then also at the agency level, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, you're cultivating a base, and how are we elevating some of those needs and priorities so agencies are doing things differently.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Thanks for sharing, you know, that we all have a role to play, you know, these various in these conversations, and that there are various resources out there that can help us start that conversation or know how to frame it in a way that resonates with different audiences. My next question for you is, you know, we've seen a change in our administration, you know, with the Biden administration and how that's changed U.S. kind of department level leadership and the subsequent changes that have occurred since then, as well as you know, more major investments in our federal infrastructure. And so, what support is available at the federal level to support changes at the state and at the local levels? You take a couple minutes to share some of those resources.
Sure. So just to give a little bit of context, in November 2021, so 2 years ago, Congress passed what was called the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, IIJA. I know it's a mouthful, but we also call this the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the bill, BIL, right? And with that law that was passed in 2021, Congress increased funding for biking, walking, and made some significant policy changes around the programs that fund biking and walking and safe routes to school. And I think the message that we've been receiving from the administration and the U.S. Department of Transportation is that there is funding for these projects, and they want to make it accessible to communities, right? The U.S. Department of Transportation has a Navigator website. It's called US DOT Navigator, that communities can go to navigate what kinds of federal funding opportunities might be out there, which ones might be a good fit for your community. And for the last year, we've been working with our partners at the national level to like promote these really widely, because we know that, you know, communities can only access them if they know they exist, right? And so I want to take the time to just highlight two really, I think, important opportunities that may kind of pique your interest. But the first one is the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is which we call TAP. And this is the largest source of federal funding dedicated to biking and walking. And again, through our state report cards, what we do is track every single dollar, TAP dollar, and how are states using that funding. And one of the great things about the bill, this new law, is that with these new provisions, it makes it a lot harder, nearly impossible, for states to sweep this funding for anything other than biking and walking, which they could do before, right? States are also required to compete out this funding and make it accessible to communities of all sizes. And so that means rural communities, mid-sized communities have an equal shot to this funding as does like some of the bigger metro areas. And also states are required to define what are high-need communities, and we have, you know, see how states can do that in different ways. But I think those are all really important changes that help communities better access this funding. And we are really excited that Arizona has had their first ever TAP competition for Greater Arizona. So I know, Kenneth, you have some resources that you can share around that, but it really is a good opportunity for local priorities to get funded. And yeah, I want to encourage you to look into that. I know the funding cycle for Arizona just ended, but that funding should be coming up, stay tuned, I guess, for the next cycle and start preparing now and thinking about what kinds of projects you may want to fund. Because the other thing about transportation alternatives funding is that it can fund things like sidewalks, bike lanes, safe crossings, but it also funds non-infrastructure programs. So programs like Safe Routes to School are eligible for funding. So that can be a really important piece to your community's like strategy around like building excitement and enthusiasm for active transportation. The other funding opportunity at the federal level that I want to mention is what we call discretionary funding. So discretionary funding, as opposed to TAP, which is kind of run through the states. Discretionary funding is funding that communities can apply to directly to the U.S. Department of Transportation. And one really exciting discretionary grant is the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant, or SS4A. And you can think of this as essentially like the federal Vision Zero program. And if you're familiar with Vision Zero, you'll know that these programs, this approach really aims to reduce roadway fatalities to zero and things about addressing safety in a really systematic way. The U.S. Department of Transportation just announced their second round of awards to communities, and communities can apply for both. There's two different kinds of tracks. There's the planning grants that help communities put together comprehensive safety action plans, which are really robust planning opportunities that are, you integrate equity analysis, you integrate a lot of different components to address roadway safety and planning. And then there's the implementation grants, which really are funding the building and construction of projects. One thing I'll mention is that implementation is highly competitive, but we've been encouraging communities to apply for the planning grants because there's a lot of funding available. The first round of funding in fiscal year 22, every single community that applied for a planning grant received one. Okay, and this year we just got the announcement, so we haven't had time to analyze, but I will guarantee you that most of the communities that probably applied in this last round probably received a planning grant as well. In the second round, the planning grant also allowed communities to do demonstration projects. So if your community really wants to do something, right, to show like, hey, we've been planning, now we want to actually demonstrate a safety improvement, the planning grants, you can do that with a planning grant. So that's a really great opportunity if you're kind of itching to get something on the ground to address safety. The planning grant does have that eligibility built in. But the overall message is there's funding for these improvements. I'll put my email in the chat, but you can always feel free to reach out to us if you have questions and you want to schedule a brief call, because I know it can be really confusing and overwhelming, and we're certainly here to help.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. More resources are being shared in the chat related to both the formula funds that come through our state as well as the discretionary program that you just mentioned. There's more out there, but SS4 is definitely one that we should be taking advantage of. Everyone should know about this. We should be talking to our city officials, our leaders, and build awareness about it and help them in their application and the implementation of these planning grants. So let's take another question here for Ryan, and we are going to get back to Edgardo. But we got a little more information here about some of these opportunities and what's going on here in Arizona. Ryan, can you talk about who's taking advantage of these federal opportunities already? What models are working? What approaches aren't necessarily working? Who's involved so far?
Yeah, I can breeze through this pretty quick so that we can still preserve some time for Q&A at the end. So Safe Routes or Safe Streets for All program has seen some awards come out of the last 2 fiscal cycles to Arizona that equal about $8 million in total. So like Vanessa was saying, those plans, they're meant to help make communities more competitive for implementation grants down the line. So this program will be around for another 3 years, maybe perhaps extended beyond that. So that 5-year cycle is well underway, and Arizona's seeing some rewards out of it. So kudos to those communities. You'll also see that the Navajo tribe is one of the biggest winners, and that's, I think, out of that equity lens, knowing that Native American communities are seeing a higher rate of fatalities and serious injuries. Also, kudos to Tucson for having this bridge program approved to help connect this disadvantaged community across I-19, and then also will tie into all the trails and greenway systems that will be are planned for the Santa Cruz River wash. So some big things happening there. I'll just highlight how this might be a pitfall. Stay on like, we need advocates to keep asking questions of their communities to make sure that these plans just don't sit on a shelf. These are planning level grants, and which will, create some cost estimates and things so that it helps know how much to budget for actual implementation, actual building the projects themselves. So don't let those sit on a shelf, and keep asking where are these priorities in terms of the overall CIP lists, so that your capital improvement projects CIP keep promoting the type of transportation development that you want to see.
I was trying to find my unmute button there. It's disappearing from me. So thank you both for sharing, these bigger opportunities. I think all of us are available. If you're like, okay, how do I navigate this grant? I feel like I'm not equipped to talk through these things. I think all of us can be resources. Safe Routes Partnership is already working with some communities on the ground here in Arizona, like Yuma, Navajo County, and then Pinnacle Prevention. We're working across the state to support communities that are interested in these funds, both urban and rural communities. So if you're like, I need some more hand-holding to get through these different funding opportunities, we're here to help. I wanted, Vanessa, if you don't mind, talking through some other policy approaches that aren't like big P policy. We got to get federal changes made. We got to get state legislature changes made, although those things are necessary as well. Like, what can happen on the ground in communities that can influence our decision makers, our council members, our local mayors, or even just city staff, the engineering department, to think beyond the status quo. And is that happening in other places? Is it happening in Arizona? Am I the only one having trouble hearing Vanessa?
Oh, sorry. Let me unmute
Okay.
myself.
There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. So there's 2 things that come to mind. One, I'm going to be a broken record, but Safe Routes to School programs are a policy approach and one that we know works. We have the evidence base that shows that programs reduce the risk of traffic fatalities. They support more biking and walking. Those programs work, and we have some great primers that might be helpful as you're talking to different, community leaders, school district, elected officials around Safe Routes to School programs. It is also what we've seen and what I've seen personally in my work in Tucson is it's an entry point for active transportation, right? For a lot of communities, and can lead to sort of more system-wide policy changes. So, in Tucson, like my friends in Tucson, my colleagues at Living Streets Alliance, they passed a nationally recognized complete streets policy, right? And sort of one of the strategies that got Tucson there was, building off the momentum of the Safe Routes to School program and working with communities in Southside Tucson that did not have access to basic amenities like sidewalks. And families, teachers became champions for this policy because they saw this impact that it had on their students. They had been running these walking school bus programs, groups of students walking to school, and really saw a need for a more systematic approach to addressing the infrastructure needs in the community, right? And so I just encourage you to look at those resources, look at those primers, and think about how Safe Routes to School might be a policy approach that works in your community. In 2019, Safe Routes Partnership, we did a census of all of the Safe Routes to School programs in the country. And what we found is 20% of the programs were actually in rural communities. And if you're aware that percentage actually reflects the percentage of people living in rural communities, which is 20%. And what we've heard and seen is that Safe Routes to School programs work in rural, suburban, urban communities, and we're happy to help guide you in what that could look like in your community. The other, I think, really cool and key kind of policy approach is thinking about what we call pop-up or demonstration projects. And I see some photos flashing on my screen now, so maybe these are the ones that I want to talk a little bit about, because we've seen across the country how communities are using these tactics to raise awareness and really, again, show people what are the tools in our toolbox, right? I mentioned that earlier. We know the tools that work, but how do we show people literally on the corner that they walk by every day that this could be different? Because I could show you pictures of these high visibility, beautiful crosswalks we have in Washington, D.C., and I will tell you that will not resonate with people in rural Arizona, right? And so the power of showing, seeing is believing, right? And I think this is a community group that we worked with in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and they just did this event 2 weeks ago, and they shared that this is the most dangerous corridor in the state, and they have been working really hard to engage their state DOT because it's a state-owned road, their city officials, local businesses who see that this is a problem for their business, and they've been talking about what can we do to improve this, how do we work towards permanent improvements. And it wasn't until they rolled out these black mats with white stripes painted. Hundreds of families were out for this annual trick-or-treat event, and they saw this overwhelming response from families. This is what we want all the time. And they had a ton of press, and they had also spokespeople that weren't them. They were business owners. They're yeah, this is an issue. And it just elevated this to a new level. And, you know, their feedback was, we didn't think that this was going to be so powerful, but it was, right? And so I want to encourage people to think about these as opportunities that don't have to cost a lot of money either. You know, these are relatively low cost materials that you can do to demonstrate what could be permanent. Another example I wanted to share was from a group that we had worked with in Little Rock, only because I talked about federal funding earlier. And I don't know if there's a slide that shows a photo of pop-up cycling. And this project was led actually by a group of librarians, right? And this group of librarians, there it is, we're really working hard to connect what was a predominantly historically Black neighborhood with a park, library, some other amenities, but had been, you know, totally, the community had totally been bulldozed through because of, you know, historic and unjust policies that, you know, that left this community without proper access to these amenities. So this was actually during the height of COVID. They decided to, for 30 days, put up these cones and these like Jersey barriers. They worked with their city to install these bike counters on the asphalt to actually count how many people were using this bike lane. They did a community survey, they did outreach as best as they could with COVID. And what they did was they built a case, and they showed that community members actually wanted this permanently. So what they ended up doing with a small amount of grant funding is they got a rendering done of what this could look like as a permanent improvement, redesigning that bridge to reduce a lane and to accommodate bicycles and pedestrians. And they submitted this, they worked with their city staff, submitted this for a transportation alternative funding application. And they were awarded $1 million grant to do this project. This was 2 years ago, so they haven't broken ground, but I think it speaks to the power of using pop-ups and demonstrations to really, you know, build a case, and also to engage community members of like, would this be something that they want and use? So those are two, I think, little, like you said kind of earlier, like little P policy approaches to kind of think about, and again, the tools in your toolbox, right?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Vanessa.
I can also
Wonderful photos.
quickly
And
share
Ryan,
that
yeah, go ahead.
there's pop-ups that, you know, we're here in Arizona, in my local community in Mesa, Arizona too. And one thing that I'd like to highlight about this, you know, process is that it's fun, right? Like this is a way that where those social elements come together with those policy elements and the built environment elements, and people can celebrate what the possibilities are. And so when you can put out a flyer with the word party in it, you know you're doing something different.
I love it. I love it. All the color, all the people involved. These are really, they are fun events. So, you know, we've talked about everything from, you know, federal, you know, big grant opportunities to changing broader policy to kind of smaller demonstration projects and, you know, infrastructure, whether it be permanent, non-permanent. And folks are probably thinking, you know, that requires a lot of people. That requires humans to volunteer. It requires humans to do grant writing. You know, who's going to advocate? You know, I love all this stuff, but I just don't have the capacity to do it. And we know infrastructure is a huge part of the conversation, but it isn't necessarily everything. We need people. And when it comes to Zero Stress movement, they have done such a fantastic job engaging their residents of all ages, even those that don't cycle, to be involved in what they do. So my next question is for Edgardo. You know, what inspiration have you drawn from residents in your community, and how are they making an impact directly on where you live?
Yes, Kenneth, and I think Vanessa mentioned it. Our kids and our youth are a great asset, you know. So I'm not leaving out the families and the entire community, but something that we also learn if we start from an early age, we can make citizens more conscious and aware, of the necessities, because I think all of us are part of the problem, but we can be part of the solution too. So seeing these kids, joining our programs like the summer bike camp, our cycling team, and other youth programs, and if we give them the necessary education, and the basic tools, they will not only be responsible pedestrians and cyclists, they will become responsible citizens. And I think that will be is very important, because now I can see with those kids that start with us since 10 years ago, and now seeing them as a grown-ups, and participating with us, bringing all these new ideas and approaching our authorities, a couple of them, if we have like a city council meeting, we put them in the front and talk about, because authorities, see these kids, leading, because they're now leaders, and I think it's not that authorities are not listening to us, the grown-ups, but if they see, the younger generations making a proposal and bringing all these ideas, because I will mention again, rural communities, I think it's a little bit harder, because we don't have the culture of a bigger city, the culture of cycling and walking, but it's possible, and I see in our younger kids being these leaders now, and being like having this kid that he finished his let's say his role as a team member in racing and all this, and he's want to continue his higher education, and we want to keep him, and so we give them the opportunity to now be a coach and be a role model for those kids, but not only for those kids, for the families, and also, like I mentioned again, for the authorities, that they can see, and that these kids want, if we give them the necessary tools and the opportunity, they will be responsible citizens.
I love it, Edgardo. This is huge. I think many of us in the room, we do this kind of advocacy, or we're running programs, and it might feel like it's always the same people. Jeff, you're tuning in from Tempe. Ed, you're with the Coalition of Arizona Bicyclists, and I think City Council, they hear from Teabag, they hear from the Coalition of Arizona Bicyclists. Megan, they hear from you all the time in Bisbee. But like, what about that next generation? Who's going to carry the torch? Who's going to actually make an impact for decades? Which is it's going to take that long. If we're really going to make that change that Ryan referred to earlier, where our streets are centered on the human scale design rather than on motor vehicles. Unfortunately, we had some questions in registration. How can we do this fast? And I think there are certain things we can do fast, certain things are going to take a long time. So Edgardo, I love your comments about the future generation and how big of an impact they make on all this. Thank you. So speaking of community, speaking of residents, this, I mentioned earlier some of the principles of smart growth. We don't need to get into all the technical details, but we know that it refers heavily to equitable development decisions, communities being engaged in development processes. A lot of times you feel like this is just happening to you. Things are growing, things are being built. What say do I have in it? Well, smart growth hopes to turn that practice on its head. So what can we be doing? What can decision makers be doing to include residents in the planning process? I open this to the entire panel.
I could jump in. So I think that equitable strategies are helping bring people into projects more and more. Another small P, parking day is another event where people can get involved and take back streets for people. This is parking day in Phoenix in 2019. These photos are from, but beyond that, there's an entire equity action plan that the federal government has gotten behind and has started embedding in all of its discretionary grants. And so now when you really are building out equitable strategies, it's an advantage for the cities to actually win these competitive grants. And so it really helps provide some accountability. And there's practical methods now that are being really looked at to ensure that public involvement is empowering and is redistributing power. So there's real ways to sort of take into account what that means. And so cost burdens will fall hardest on low-income families. It's hardest to have access to get around when you don't have a vehicle, or the best way to get around is by a personal vehicle, and the costs that encumber a family with that. Low-income families are dedicating more than 37 or approximately 37% of their income towards getting around by vehicle or other forms of transportation that are just very cost burdensome. And so we can keep this in mind, and that can also kind of get back to that idea of what do we measure? What is the success the successful outcome that we're after? Is it only measuring the capacity of our streets for vehicles, or could we be measuring and monitoring other things to actually promote outcomes that align more equitably? But it doesn't happen without including more voices and making space for people at the table. So some empowerment examples that I'd like to highlight here is that I kudos to the city of Phoenix with their Phoenix Can Do Community Connectors program, where they're actually reaching out to community leaders, funding them 10 hours a month for a program to help really get word out and connect with communities to get communities involved. And then the Scrado has been a great community partner, engaging people on issues of design through creative processes. It's an artist collective, very powerful in South Phoenix. They've had a wonderful impact in the extension of the light rail through South Phoenix, and they're going to continue to do so for projects to come. Because they're part of my team on the 3rd Street Bridge in South Phoenix. So it's wonderful to see this empowerment happening, this shared space. And it's also important for everybody to acknowledge in the communities or in the industry that community experts do deserve compensation for their time and their expertise. They are experts within their own communities and deserve a place at the table and don't need to be cut out of the budget. So this, to do so would be lip service. And we can't allow equity to turn into lip service. It's embedded in plans. It's embedded in evaluation processes. It's embedded in our applications. We have to uphold those promises.
Vanessa or Edgardo, any thoughts about community engagement or partnerships that are necessary to make these changes happen?
I have a couple of thoughts, and then I'll pass the mic over. When I think about engagement and, to your point, Ryan, about the equity action plan and like, what does it take to do equitable community engagement? And it takes resources, right? It takes building engagement into project budgets. And if you don't have a project budget for engagement, then thinking really creatively about the partnerships you have outside your agency, because I will tell you that most likely your agency alone does not have the reach to do equitable engagement on its own, right? And we've seen some really successful partnership models come from agencies partnering with community-based organizations, grassroots organizations, hiring community members, paying them to do and lead engagement efforts. to make sure that they are adequately reaching and involving and engaging residents who may not otherwise be able to attend traditional engagement meetings. I also want to do a shout out to public health, because we've seen public health really be incredible trusted partners in communities, and thinking, you know, for transportation agencies or public works agencies who are, you know, are designing, planning streets, like including public health, it can be really important in all kinds of communities, but especially in rural communities where, you know, there's health clinics or other, or you know, health, federally qualified health centers where there's, you know, health is like, public health is a key partner, and I would encourage folks to really make sure that they are, you know, broadening their reach by thinking really creatively of those partnerships to also maximize their resources as well.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. So Edgardo, you know, when we were planning for this webinar, you talked about some plans with actually Nogales across the border, and potential, you know, opportunity for bicycle lanes. But there's some frustration there, knowing that, you know, sometimes things get into plans, or there's prospects to, you know, talking with city officials and being able to add infrastructure, but you get kind of discouraged when things don't happen. Is there a better way that you think communities could be involved in these kind of decisions?
Oh, yes, we you know, in the learning process, you know, we had this huge plan, and actually in our city was a master plan for bike lanes, you know, and I'm talking about like 6 years ago, you know, so it was going to be wonderful to have bike lanes, you know, but I think it's, to be honest, and as a cyclist, I think it's too much for our community right now, because we're still growing. I think cyclists are a minority. It's very important to not have cyclists to now, you know, to be a minority is very important. And I think what we are trying to let know the authorities now is that they're very important. I'm not against bike lanes. If we haven't, that will be, I think, the best thing that we can achieve in our community. But just to let know the community that cyclists are also a vehicle, you know, that we can share the roads. And I think for now, I think if we achieve that, it's going to be wonderful. And then we can start thinking on bike lanes. And fortunately, here in our community, or, you know, or mayors, how can I say, the fastest street is only regularly 25 miles, you know, our streets. So they're safer for cyclists and pedestrians. But to achieve a bike route will be beautiful, you know. But for now, I think creating that culture of bike lane and pedestrian will be enough for us.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts, those comments about the broader culture shift, you know, that happens, and how do you give bicyclists, pedestrians a voice and space, and treat them as, you know, equal to the motor vehicle. So thanks for those comments. We have 5 minutes left, and I really want to take a couple questions from our participants here. Thank you all for sticking with us through the entire program. I hope that the conversation has been inspiring, helpful. And I see a question kind of budding from Megan, both about rural communities. How do you deal with this issue of highways? Do you want to reframe the question at all, Megan, or?
Well, sorry that I had to arrive late. I'm sure I missed a lot of great information. And so if you already covered this, I'm sorry, but one of the biggest challenges in Bisbee and in other rural towns in Arizona is that our communities are connected through state and county highways. And when you're trying to create safe pedestrian and bike paths, that means you have to alter a highway. So how do you, well, I know how I'm doing it, but I'm curious to know if other people have had to address this issue. As you know, ADOT does not specifically create bike and pedestrian paths. So for one thing, you have to get a feasibility study done, which is extremely expensive. And then from that, you have to, get an engineering firm that's accredited by ADOT. So it's a very pricey and lengthy process. And I appreciate the ideas of doing these pop-up things for pedestrians and cyclists, but you can't just do that on a highway. So be curious to hear how you all address these types of things.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
I can jump in first because I think I'm going to draw from the example I shared, Megan, earlier. I don't know if you saw it, but the example of the pop-up that we did in Scranton, one of the reasons why those crosswalks are placed the way they are is because the state Department of Transportation did not approve them on the state portion of the road. So they were approved on the side streets, which were city-owned. So that was kind of both intentional and also like working through that process with the state DOT. I hear you, like that's an issue throughout the country, like in rural communities, and we've seen some innovative things coming from some states, but still it's like, yeah, pushing the boulder up the hill. One thing for this particular community, and I would encourage you to kind of look at or inquire within your state DOT, is that because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, one of the requirements for states is to do what we call a vulnerable road user safety assessment, or VRU. And for this particular community, that meant that that particular corridor was drawing attention because they realized for the first time the state DOT actually has to do something to address this because of the new legislation. And I believe Arizona is one of the states that is required to use at least 15% of what we call highway safety improvement funds because of the high rates of pedestrian fatalities to go towards safety improvements on these roadways that are dangerous. And that means part of that assessment is that state DOTs are being kind of forced to have action items come out of those evaluations. So it's not enough to say these roadways are dangerous, these highways are dangerous, and they don't even necessarily need to be state highways, but most of the time they are because of the high vehicle speeds, right? But essentially the legislation requires action items to come out of those VRU assessments, which are actually due today, November 15th. And so Kenneth might be more up on where ADOT Arizona is at in those, but those can be, again, kind of system-wide planning to kind of like, thinking about those priorities and like building in the routes and things like that.
Thanks, Vanessa. We are at time at 12:30. Steve Jennings, you slipped in a question before 12:30, so I'm gonna let it slide. Maybe can someone answer this question about developers and getting it right when they build it the first time? If folks have to hop off, we bid you farewell. Thanks again for joining. If you want to hang out with us for a couple more minutes, feel free to do so.
I'll give a shout out to Cul-de-sac here in Tempe with regards to a developer with a very intentional approach towards doing things right from the beginning. And if you haven't heard about Cul-de-sac Tempe, they're really quickly pride themselves on being the first car-free developer since the advent of the car. And so what they did was they they blazed a path with the city of Tempe and Valley Metro to do the first offsite improvements between their community and a light rail station, so that they improve the crosswalk access to the platform itself. They're also embracing a lot of smart growth principles in terms of missing middle housing, things of that nature, and becoming a walkable community, accelerating things that are accessible on site, such as a grocery store, such as a restaurant, such as a bike shop, and a bunch of micro businesses that are in 500 square foot live work units. So they're accelerating all those things faster than a typical developer would. Those are things that would typically come in last phase of a development. So a development that's going to cover multiple acres will be broken up into multiple phases. And there's typically the idea that retail requires, X number of homes within the development before they're willing to support those social or those commercial entities. But I think with some creative upfront lease rates at a reduced cost and making that more feasible, cul-de-sac has really blazed the path there in terms of doing things a little bit differently. And developers overall, to not just rely on developer goodwill, you have to have a city with a very forward-thinking subdivision standards, developing their subdivision code, their engineering codes and things of that nature to really advocate for the users a complete street, a variety of housing types, really mixing incomes, and being mindful that land and acres space within the city is a highly sought after resource, and nothing that should go wasted. In my time in seeing development, I've seen how the level of service transportation impact analysis will actually reduce the amount of housing units within the development, because they're worried about the impacts to intersections and traffic delays and all the expensive infrastructure costs that come along with that. So I think that if cities get creative and get forward thinking about their transportation systems and actually support greater number of housing units, they can achieve smart growth outcomes earlier in their development phase. And that's kind of on the outskirts of development, but then also just promoting infill development as much as possible, so that you're already tapping into infrastructure that's already in place within the cores of cities where multiple transportation options are already available, and we don't have to worry about necessarily the impacts of including a bunch of new neighbors with a bunch of new cars in the right setting. You don't have to assume so much car dependence. And we all love inviting new neighbors into our communities, making our community stronger, while also mitigating those impacts that come with a bunch of overdependence on cars.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan, and thanks all for your questions. It is 12:35. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. And I want to give one final thank you to Ryan, Edgardo, Vanessa for all the wisdom that was shared today, all the resources, a very full chat box. And I hope that this work will continue and that we will work with one another to make some progress on people first streets, engaging communities, on building the capacity of residents, of working with youth. And yeah, if y'all want to show some love to the panelists in the chat, I think that'd be wonderful. Otherwise, have a fantastic Wednesday and see you at our next webinar. We don't have a date yet, but we will add you all to our mailing list so you can stay informed about our next episode of our Smart Growth Arizona series.